There is a point somewhere beyond ordinary tiredness, when being awake stops feeling like effort and starts becoming something stranger. A person who has been awake too long may still be standing, still talking, still insisting that they are fine. They may answer questions, crack jokes, even keep working. From the outside, the damage can seem small at first. A missed word, a slower reaction, a burst of irritation. But inside the brain, something more serious is already underway. Attention loosens, judgment grows porous, emotion becomes harder to steady, perception begins to drift. Most unsettling of all, the mind losing its grip is often the same mind being asked to decide whether anything is wrong. That is what makes sleep deprivation so unnerving. It does not always arrive like collapse. Quite often, it arrives like confidence, like the feeling that you can keep going, like the quiet conviction that one more hour will not matter, then another, then another. Modern life has wrapped that belief in admiration. Staying awake is often treated as discipline and endurance. But the human organism does not read the bargain that way. Beneath the language of productivity and willpower, the body keeps its own accounting. Eventually, it collects. Sleep is so familiar that it rarely seems mysterious. We do it every day. We surrender to it so often that it can feel like a routine interruption rather than one of the deepest biological requirements of animal life. Yet from another angle, sleep is a very strange thing to need. For hours at a time, an animal becomes less responsive, less mobile, less aware of danger, and less able to defend itself. And still the need returns with absolute regularity. Ignore it for long enough, and something begins to fail, not only in mood or memory, but in the integrity of thought itself. This documentary begins there. At the point where wakefulness stops being normal and starts becoming a test, the human body was never designed to win. The deeper question is stranger and more consequential than that. Why does the human organism need sleep so deeply that, when wakefulness is pushed too far, the mind begins to fail, the body begins to break, and survival itself can come into question? To answer that, we have to begin with the visible cost of staying awake. In the early 1960s, a teenage boy named Randy Gardner agreed to do something that sounds, at first glance, almost simple. He would try to stay awake for as long as possible. The attempt was framed as a public challenge, but as the hours stretched on, then far beyond what the body expects, the experiment began to reveal something less playful. He did not simply become sleepy, he became altered. As the wakefulness continued, the changes were not theatrical, but unmistakable. His attention faltered. His short-term memory grew less reliable. His mood shifted. Certain mental tasks became harder. And the case became famous not because it ended in spectacle, but because it exposed something subtler and more disturbing. A human being can look more intact than he really is, while sleep deprivation quietly dismantles the systems that make intactness possible. That is the first great danger of prolonged wakefulness. It does not destroy function all at once. It erodes it unevenly. One capacity holds while another slips. Speech may survive while attention fragments. Social performance may continue while internal coherence weakens. A sleep-deprived person can appear present long after that presence has begun to decay. Exhausted people do not simply become slower. They become poorer judges of their own reliability. Another famous case, darker in tone and harder to forget. Push this even further. In 1959, New York radio disc jockey Peter Tripp remained awake for days as part of a charity stunt conducted in a glass booth in Times Square. At first, the event carried the atmosphere of spectacle. He broadcast, interacted, kept performing, but the longer he stayed awake, the more alarming the changes became. Reports from the episode describe hallucinations, perceptual distortions, emotional instability, and episodes of confusion that suggested the boundary between external reality and the exhausted brain's own constructions had begun to loosen. This is one of the most arresting features of extreme sleep loss. The brain does not merely become weak. It can begin to generate a world that is no longer fully trustworthy. Sounds are misread. Faces are misinterpreted. Intentions seem altered. Meaning becomes unstable. In fragments and flashes, the machinery of reality testing comes under strain. Even these famous cases, though, have to be handled carefully. They were not pristine laboratory studies in the modern sense. Monitoring was imperfect. The exact presence or absence of brief microsleeps is difficult to establish with total certainty. In Tripp's case, stimulant use complicates interpretation. But those complications do not weaken the central lesson. The story of sleep deprivation is what happens when a deeply rooted biological need is treated as negotiable and the organism begins, stage by stage, to resist. What is striking is how early it begins. Long before the legendary marathon cases, the first fractures are already visible. Sleep loss impairs sustained attention. It disrupts working memory. It changes emotional tone, often making people more reactive, less patient, and less capable of self-control. Judgment grows noisier. The mind becomes more impulsive and less precise. That is why sleep deprivation does not only produce weariness, it produces cognitive instability. This is where the central mystery begins to sharpen. If missing food brings hunger, and missing water brings thirst, what exactly does missing sleep bring? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. Tiredness. But that word is too small. Tiredness suggests depleted energy, as though the body were simply running low like a battery. Yet the symptoms of sleep deprivation do not behave like simple low fuel. They affect mood, timing, memory, perception, coordination, and the subtle continuity by which a person remains mentally themselves from one moment to the next. Wakefulness prolonged beyond its proper bounds does not merely exhaust the mind. It begins to disorganize it. Once that becomes clear, the deeper question is difficult to avoid. If the loss of sleep can so quickly produce not just fatigue, but distortion, if it can make perception less faithful, emotion less governed, judgment less trustworthy, then sleep must be doing more than offering comfort. It must be supporting something essential to the maintenance of waking consciousness itself. For a long time, science had no clean answer to what that something was. Sleep was too ordinary and too elusive. Everyone experienced it, yet no one could easily explain it. It looked passive. It looked like absence. It looked, from the outside, like the temporary suspension of meaningful activity. And that appearance would mislead scientists for decades, because the next step in this story is not the discovery of what sleep does. It is the discovery that sleep is not what it seems. For much of human history, sleep was easy to observe and difficult to understand. A sleeping person lay still, withdrew from the world, responded less, and seemed to enter a condition defined mostly by what was missing: less movement, less awareness. In that sense, sleep appeared to be the negative image of waking life, a dimming. If wakefulness was the active state, the state of thought, decision, labor, language, danger, and survival. Then sleep could easily be imagined as what remained when activity shut down. That intuition was not irrational. It was simply incomplete. Sleep does look passive from the outside. The problem was that looking passive and being passive are not the same thing. One of the first major clues emerged not from healthy volunteers in a modern sleep laboratory, but from illness. In the aftermath of the encephalitis lethargica epidemic in the early 20th century, the neurologist Konstantin von Economo encountered patients whose conditions forced a strange insight into view. Some were overwhelmed by pathological sleepiness. Others suffered the opposite extreme, severe insomnia, as though the ability to enter normal sleep had been biologically disrupted. These were not abstractions. They were bodies and minds behaving as if something in the machinery of sleep and wakefulness had been physically damaged. From these contrasting syndromes, von Economo drew an idea that would prove foundational. Sleep and wake, he argued, were not vague whole-body states that simply came and went like weather. They were linked to specific regions and functions in the brain. Sleep was not merely the fading of consciousness when stimulation dropped below some threshold. It was regulated, organized, built into the nervous system. This was a profound shift. If sleep depended on identifiable brain systems, then it was not simply the absence of waking activity. It was a biological state the organism actively entered. And if wakefulness depended on brain systems too, then being awake was not merely the natural default that remained when sleep withdrew. It also had to be generated and sustained. That second half of the insight became sharper in the mid-20th century through the work of Giuseppe Maruzzi and Horace Magoon. Their studies of the brainstem reticular formation helped establish that wakefulness is actively maintained by neural systems that keep the cortex aroused and responsive. It meant that waking was not the neutral baseline from which sleep was a retreat. It too had to be upheld. Once that idea enters the story, the cost of staying awake begins to look different. If wakefulness is an active biological state, then forcing it to continue is not the same as simply postponing rest. It is prolonging a mode of operation the brain is designed to balance, modulate, and eventually relinquish. It means holding one side of a living alternation in place longer than the system prefers. That history matters here. The early difficulty was not only technological, it was conceptual. Scientists were trying to understand a state that ordinary experience had disguised. Sleep seemed empty because the sleeper was quiet. It seemed inactive because behavior had slowed. But beneath that stillness, the nervous system was not dropping into nothingness. It was moving into a different form of organization. The more researchers looked, the harder it became to maintain the old picture. Pathological insomnia suggested that sleep could fail as a biological process, not just as a habit. Brain injury could disrupt the balance between sleeping and waking. Wakefulness itself turned out to depend on specific activating systems. The boundary between the two states was beginning to resemble not a simple on-off switch, but a regulated exchange. And that idea transformed the meaning of sleep deprivation. That, in turn, set up the next discovery. Once scientists stopped treating sleep as a blank interval, they began to find structure inside it. Not just one state, but several, not just inactivity, but patterned physiological change. Not just rest, but a hidden architecture. The night, it turned out, was doing far more than anyone had imagined. When researchers finally learned how to listen more closely to the sleeping brain, One of the most important assumptions in the history of sleep began to collapse. Sleep was not a flat descent into quiet. It was not one undifferentiated state stretching from nightfall to morning. Beneath closed eyes and still limbs, the brain was moving through patterns, distinct phases, shifting rhythms, repeating cycles, each with its own physiology and its own place in the order of the night. This was the force of the work associated with Nathaniel Kleitman and, later, Eugene Osorinsky. Their studies helped reveal that sleep had structure. Most famously, the discovery of rapid eye movement sleep showed that the sleeping organism could enter a state that was, in some ways, startlingly active. The eyes moved quickly beneath the eyelids. Brain activity changed. The old picture of sleep as mere inactivity became harder to defend. What had looked like simple shutdown turned out to contain intensity, variation, and internal order. That realization did more than enrich sleep science. It changed the meaning of sleep loss itself. If sleep is made of different states arranged in sequence, then to miss sleep is not merely to lose hours. It is to interrupt a program. It is to forego not one biological condition, but a patterned set of them. A night without sleep does not just reduce rest. It cancels an architecture the body appears to expect and repeatedly rebuild. This is one reason the everyday language around sleep can be misleading. We often speak as though there were one substance called sleep, something that can be accumulated, delayed, reduced, or replaced in roughly the way one might manage a budget. But the physiology points to something more intricate. Sleep has stages. It has timing. It has flow. And that flow is not random. The significance of this becomes clearer when one steps back from the laboratory and looks at the body's relationship to time itself. Nathaniel Kleitman's cave experiments and the later development of chronobiology helped show that sleep does not belong only to the night in a cultural sense. It belongs to internal time. Even when external cues are reduced, the human organism continues trying to organize itself rhythmically. The rise and fall of alertness, the timing of temperature, hormonal release, and the pressure to sleep are not governed only by schedule or intention. They are shaped by biological timing mechanisms that run beneath conscious choice. That deepened the mystery again. Fatigue was not simply the result of having used up mental energy. The need for sleep was tied to a broader system of temporal regulation. Later work on the suprachiasmatic nucleus would show that the brain contains a central clock, a structure intimately involved in synchronizing bodily rhythms with the day-night cycle. That means staying awake too long is not merely prolonging effort. It is, at certain points, pushing against the body's own temporal organization. One is not only tired, one is becoming mistimed. That distinction matters. It helps explain why wakefulness can start to feel uncanny in the middle of the night, or why exhaustion is not always experienced as a smooth, linear decline. The body is not simply measuring how long one has been awake. It is managing overlapping systems, accumulating sleep pressure, tracking circadian phase, coordinating internal functions whose timing has consequences. To remain awake past certain thresholds is to drag conscious life across biological boundaries. It was not meant to ignore indefinitely. And once sleep is understood in these terms, as structured, cyclical, and timed, the cost of losing it becomes harder to dismiss. Sleep deprivation is not just the subtraction of rest. It is interference with an organized process whose hidden order helps keep the waking self stable. Memory, mood, attention, impulse control, and subjective coherence do not merely deteriorate, because the brain is tired in some vague way. They begin to loosen because the organism has been denied entry into states it appears to need in sequence. That also explains why the problem of sleep loss grows deeper the more closely one looks at it. At first, the effects seem psychological, but once the architecture of sleep comes into view, they look like signs that a carefully ordered maintenance cycle has been interrupted. The waking mind is not a machine that runs continuously until energy runs out. It is a state that depends on regularly giving way to other states, and that opens the door to a more severe possibility. If sleep is not passive, and if it is not uniform, and if the body has built such careful timing around it, then perhaps sleep is not simply helpful to waking life. Perhaps it is protective. Perhaps wakefulness can be sustained only because sleep repeatedly restores conditions that waking itself gradually disturbs. If that is true, then prolonged sleep loss should not stop at mental disorganization. Beyond a certain point, it should reach further past mood, past memory, past perception. Eventually, it should begin to affect the organism at a deeper level, where the problem is no longer confusion or irritability, but survival. That is where the story turns darker. For a long time, the most visible consequences of sleep deprivation were the ones people could observe directly: fatigue, mistakes, emotional volatility, the strange brittleness of an overextended mind. But beneath those familiar effects lay a more difficult question. What happens if sleep loss continues far beyond the ordinary? What if wakefulness is forced not for one night, or two, or even several days in a public stunt, but to the point where the body can no longer hide the cost? Some of the most disturbing answers came not from human spectacle, but from animal research. In the 1980s, Alan Rechtschaffen and colleagues conducted experiments that would become central to the modern understanding of sleep's necessity. Rats deprived of sleep did not simply become less efficient. They deteriorated. They ate more and yet lost weight. Their bodies became dysregulated. Over time, they grew severely ill and eventually died. The result was stark enough to alter the field. Sleep deprivation, at least in mammals, could not be treated as a mere nuisance or performance problem. At sufficient intensity, it became catastrophic. What made those studies powerful also made them unsettling. The animals died, but the precise mechanism of death was not simple or singular. It was not as though sleep loss switched off one easily named organ system and left the rest intact. Instead, the picture suggested breakdown across regulation itself: thermoregulation, metabolism, physiological integrity, the body's capacity to maintain internal order. Sleep began to look less like a luxury and more like one of the conditions under which the organism preserves coherence. That is an important idea. We are comfortable with survival functions when they have obvious objects. Food provides nutrients. Water maintains hydration. Oxygen supports cellular respiration. But sleep resists that style of explanation. It is clearly necessary, yet it does not seem to do just one thing. What the animal experiment suggested was not that sleep serves one narrow purpose, but that the absence of sleep begins to unravel multiple systems at once. Here the central question becomes more haunting. Why should a state that leaves an animal vulnerable be so indispensable that its prolonged absence becomes lethal? Why would evolution preserve something so costly unless the alternative were even more costly still? By this point, the answer could no longer be something simple, like the brain needs a break. The evidence was pushing toward a deeper conclusion. Sleep appears bound up with the body's ongoing ability to remain alive in an ordered way. Human medicine offers a tragic counterpart to this idea in the rare disorder known as fatal familial insomnia. The name itself is almost too stark, but the condition is real, a prion disease in which the brain's ability to generate normal sleep progressively collapses. As it advances, the consequences are devastating. Severe insomnia is accompanied by autonomic disruption, cognitive decline, bodily instability, and, ultimately, death. This is not ordinary insomnia turned up to its maximum. It is a catastrophic neurological disease, and it must be understood on those terms. As a natural experiment, it is hard to ignore. Cases like this strip away the illusion that sleep is optional. In everyday life, people negotiate with sleep. They shorten it, delay it, crowd it out, boast about enduring without it. That is possible only because the body is resilient enough to absorb a degree of insult before the bill comes due. But resilience should not be mistaken for indifference. The organism is not untouched by sleep loss. It is compensating, sometimes desperately, until it no longer can. It also helps explain why the effects of sleep deprivation often seem disproportionate. It is not just that one feels worse after a poor night's sleep. It is that the systems being strained are deeply entangled. Mood regulation depends on brain function that is itself sensitive to sleep history. Cognitive control depends on stable neural coordination. Immune behavior, hormonal timing, metabolic balance, temperature regulation all appear, to varying degrees, to be shaped by sleep and circadian state. When sleep is denied, the losses do not remain neatly isolated in one corner of physiology. They begin to spread. At this point, there is a strong temptation to search for one final, decisive explanation. Perhaps sleep exists for memory, or emotional reset, or energy conservation, or synaptic recalibration, or endocrine timing, or immune repair. But what the most severe forms of deprivation imply is that the need for sleep may be woven through all of these and more. That is why the body begins to break in ways that can seem frustratingly diffuse. The absence of sleep may not reveal one single failure point, because sleep itself may sustain multiple levels of order at once. By now, the shape of the mystery has changed again. At first, sleep deprivation looked like a threat to clear thinking. Then it became a clue that sleep was an active brain state. Then sleep acquired structure, timing, and internal architecture. Now the stakes have widened beyond the mind altogether. Without sleep, the organism may lose not just clarity, but regulation, not just performance, but integrity. And once the story reaches that point, another question rises naturally from it. If sleep protects so many layers of order, mental, physiological, temporal, what exactly is happening during those hours when consciousness loosens and the body becomes still? What work is being done there that wakefulness cannot safely postpone forever? Science has made real progress on that question, but it has not solved it once and for all. By the time one arrives at this final layer of the story, sleep no longer resembles the simple opposite of waking life. It has become something more difficult and more interesting, a recurring biological condition in which the organism seems to protect itself from the costs of remaining continuously awake. But what does that protection actually consist of? What, beneath awareness, is sleep doing? Modern research has offered several important clues, each illuminating part of the answer without fully exhausting it. Some of the most compelling work suggests that sleep is a time of maintenance in the brain, a period when processes of clearance, recalibration, and restoration may proceed differently than they do during waking life. One especially influential line of research proposed that the sleeping brain may allow more effective movement of cerebrospinal fluid through brain tissue, potentially helping remove metabolic byproducts. It reframes sleep not as shutdown, but as housekeeping at a level the waking mind does not directly feel. Even here, caution matters. The science is active, evolving, and not without debate. The brain's nocturnal maintenance systems are not a solved puzzle, and no single discovery has closed the case on why sleep is necessary. But the larger implication remains valuable. Sleep increasingly looks like a state in which the body and brain can perform forms of regulation that waking consciousness, for all its advantages, is poorly suited to sustain indefinitely. Other lines of evidence point toward memory and learning. Experiences gathered during the day do not simply remain where they first appeared. Sleep seems to participate in reshaping, stabilizing, or selectively strengthening memory traces. The night is not merely the absence of experience. It may be one of the periods in which experience is reorganized into something durable. Wakefulness alone is incomplete. Conscious life can acquire impressions, but sleep may help decide what becomes part of a usable mind. Emotional regulation offers another clue. Anyone who has gone too long without sleep knows, from experience alone, how fragile the emotional world becomes under exhaustion. Irritability rises, perspective narrows, reactions sharpen. Neuroscience adds depth to that familiar fact. Sleep appears to help preserve the brain's ability to manage effective life with proportion. In that sense, sleep supports not only cognition, but the emotional steadiness by which a person remains socially legible to others and internally legible to themselves. There are also immune and metabolic dimensions. The body's relation to infection, inflammation, glucose regulation, hormonal timing, and thermoregulation appears intertwined with sleep in ways that are still being mapped. None of these functions alone is likely to explain the whole necessity of sleep. Taken together, though, they suggest something important. Sleep may be indispensable, not because it performs one grand, singular act, but because it provides a recurring window in which many forms of upkeep can be coordinated at once. That possibility changes the tone of the whole question. We often imagine survival in dramatic terms: fight or flight, hunger or abundance, injury or escape. Sleep points toward a quieter kind of necessity, not the necessity of sudden crisis, but of repeated maintenance. The organism survives not only by responding to threats, but by regularly withdrawing into conditions under which accumulated strain can be managed, internal timing restored, and the instability created by wakefulness brought back within livable bounds. Perhaps that is why sleep remains both familiar and elusive. It is everywhere in life, yet much of what it does happens outside introspection. We can feel sleepiness, but we do not directly feel memory being reorganized, or timing systems being realigned, or metabolic waste being handled, or emotional thresholds being quietly reset. We enter sleep as subjects, but many of its functions belong to the body as an organism rather than to the self as an observer. It also helps explain why the desire for one elegant answer has remained unsatisfied. Sleep may resist reduction because it is not serving one isolated purpose. It may be part of the very way complex animals remain temporally ordered, cognitively coherent, and physiologically stable across repeated cycles of waking life. Asking why humans need sleep to survive is a little like asking why a city needs sanitation. Maintenance crews, timing systems, communication networks. and periods of reduced activity all at once. The answer is distributed through the conditions that make continued functioning possible. So the final insight is not that sleep has been fully explained. It has not. The final insight is that the demand for sleep tells us something profound about the kind of beings we are. Human consciousness is powerful, inventive, and often proud of its own endurance. It can delay, override, suppress, and resist, but not indefinitely. However ambitious the waking mind may be, it remains dependent on a biological rhythm. It does not command outright. Sleep returns not as a preference, but as a limit, and in that limit there is a kind of truth. The organism cannot remain itself by being awake all the time. It must repeatedly surrender. It must give up responsiveness in order to preserve responsiveness, relinquish control in order to remain capable of control, step away from the world in order to return to it intact. So when we ask why humans need sleep to survive, the answer is larger than rest and more unsettling than fatigue. Sleep deprivation first reveals itself in the mind. Attention slips. Mood destabilizes. Judgment grows porous. The world becomes slightly less trustworthy, and the person inside that world may be one of the last to notice. Then the story deepens. Sleep is not passive. Wakefulness is not neutral. The brain is organized to alternate between states. And the night is not blank time, but a structured biological sequence with its own architecture and timing. Push too far against that design, and the cost spreads outward from cognition to regulation, from experience to physiology, from the fragility of thought to the fragility of the organism itself. What modern science has made increasingly clear is that sleep is not an indulgence added onto life after more important things are done. It is one of the conditions under which a complex human being remains coherent at all. Memory, emotional balance, metabolic order, circadian timing, and perhaps even forms of neural maintenance that waking life cannot fully provide. These do not seem to sit outside sleep as optional benefits. They appear woven into it. And still, part of the mystery remains: we do not yet possess one final, complete, universally satisfying account of sleep's deepest function. But perhaps that is fitting. Sleep belongs to one of the oldest bargains in animal life: the acceptance of vulnerability in exchange for renewal. Every night, the organism withdraws not because it has failed, but because remaining fully engaged without interruption would, in the end, be the greater danger. Perhaps that is what sleep reveals most clearly about human life. We are not built for continuous mastery. We are rhythmic creatures. We endure by alternating. We survive not by conquering our limits, but by obeying some of them. And sleep, quiet and recurring as it is, may be one of the deepest of those limits